Hello everyone, and welcome to my CBS B&B Full Today channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The fallout began still, the way most explosions at Forrester Creations always do, before unrestricted doors beneath polished grins, and inside apartments where decades of love, treason, and ambition had soaked into the walls. What Steffy revealed that autumn wasn't just another secret dragged into the light. It was the kind of verity that rearranged the history and poisoned the future. Rich Forrester had lived his life believing he understood the fault lines of his family, believing that no matter how violent the storms came, Brooke Logan would always be the constant force pulling him back to reinforcement. But Steffy's disclosure shattered that vision with brutal perfection, exposing a verity that Ridge couldn't explain, excuse, or forgive. Steffy didn't come fortified with enterprise or emotional hypotheticals. What she brought was substantiation, vindicated, inarguable, and ruinous. It was evidence that Brooke had known commodity pivotal, commodity life, altering, and had chosen silence when honesty could have changed everything. Ridge's mind replayed the times in rear, revisiting every argument, every conciliation, every moment he defended Brooke against his children's resentment. The consummation settled like a weight on his casket. This wasn't a misreading or a mistake born of fear. This was a deliberate choice that had altered the course of his family. Ridge's wrathfulness was immediate. At first, it manifested as unbelief, the kind that numbs the senses and detainments the pain. He wandered through Forrester Creations in a muddle, once sketches and mannequins, past workers who tasted commodity was wrong but dared not ask. The structure that formerly represented heritage and consanity now felt concave, echoing with the ghosts of choices he could no longer justify. Every memory of Brooke, her fidelity, her offerings, her proclamations of love, now felt tainted by the knowledge that she had withheld the verity when it signified most. Brooke, for her part, tasted the shift before Ridge ever brazened her. There was a pressure in the air, a dispassionateness in his absence that settled into her bones. She had spent times navigating Ridge's moods, surviving his dolor, forgiving his backstabbings, and believing that their bond was stronger than any secret. Yet this bone had always visited her, lurking in the corners of her heart like a shadow she refused to face. She told herself she had defended him, defended the family, defended the fragile peace that had taken so long to rebuild. But deep down she knew the verity she had buried was no way truly gone. It was simply staying. When Ridge eventually brazened Brooke, the explosion was ineluctable. His rage wasn't theatrical or transitory. It was raw, consuming, and final. Times of undetermined resentment surged to the face, fueled by the belief that the woman he trusted most had formerly again chosen control over honesty. The words he hurled weren't just expressions of wrathfulness, they were affirmations of disillusionment. For Ridge, this wasn't about one taradiddle or one elision. It was about a pattern that he could no longer ignore. The expression that cut deepest, "Get out of my life," was not spoken smoothly. It carried the weight of futurity, the kind that leaves no room for reinterpretation or stopgap. Ridge was done attributing Brooke's conduct, done explaining her jest. To his children, done immolating his own boundaries in the name of love. For the first time in decades, he saw Brooke not as the woman who held his heart, but as the mastermind of a pain he could no longer survive. Brooke was stupefied, not because Ridge was angry, but because this time his wrathfulness felt irremovable. There was no vacillation in his eyes, no flicker of mistrustfulness she could cleave to. She realized too late that the foundation she believed was unbreakable had been eroding for times, weakened by secrets, negotiations, and the implied belief that Ridge would always forgive her. As the reality set in, Brooke faced the ruinous verity that love doesn't survive without trust, and she had eventually crossed the line that love couldn't redeem. The ripple goods were immediate and far-reaching. Steffy, though burdened by guilt, stood establishment in her belief that the verity had to come out. She had grown tired of watching her father immolate his happiness for a relationship erected on picky honesty. Her disclosure wasn't an act of atrocity but of protection, a final attempt to free Ridge from a cycle that had defined his life for too long. Yet indeed she couldn't have anticipated the depth of the fallout, the way it fractured what little consanity remained in the family. Eric Forrester watched the destruction with a heavy heart, fading the familiar pattern of love and loss that had visited the Forrester heritage for generations. He'd seen Ridge and Brooke tear each other piecemeal ahead, only to find their way back through sheer force of habit and craving. But this time felt different. This time the fracture ran deeper, cutting through times of participated history and leaving scars that couldn't be hidden beneath conciliation. As news of the battle spread, alliances shifted and old injuries restarted. Hope set up herself caught between fidelity to her mama and the inarguable reality of Ridge's pain. She plotted to attune the Brooke she adored with the woman able of such a dangerous choice. Meanwhile, Taylor's absence impended large, her name rumored in exchanges filled with enterprise and remorse. The possibility that Ridge might eventually close the chapter on Brooke restarted doors long allowed, sealed, stirring feelings that complicated an formerly unpredictable situation. For Ridge, the fate was a lonely reckoning. Wrathfulness gave way to grief, and grief to a quiet clarity that felt both liberating and ruinous. He mourned not just the loss of Brooke, but the interpretation of himself who believed love could conquer every excrescence. In choosing to walk down, Ridge was forced to defy the cost of his fidelity and the times he'd spent forgiving injuries that no way completely healed. Brooke, left to face the consequences of her silence, set up herself stripped of the defenses she had reckoned on for so long. There were no speeches important enough to undo the damage, no grand gestures able of restoring what had been broken. For the first time she had to accept that love doesn't guarantee remission, and that occasionally, the topmost treason is believing you know what's stylish for someone differently. The future of the Forrester family now hangs in the balance, shaped by a disclosure that changed everything. Ridge's explosive rejection of Brooke marks a turning point not just for their relationship, but for the entire heritage they helped make. As feelings continue to collide and secrets hang to surface, one verity remains inarguable. This wasn't just another dramatic moment, it was the end of an period, and the mourning of consequences that will echo through every corner of their lives. The silence that followed Ridge Forrester's explosive rejection of Brooke Logan was far more cautioning than the words themselves. It was the kind of silence that settles into the walls of a participated home, adhering to photos, recollections, and spaces formerly filled with horselaugh and conciliation. Brooke remained standing long after Ridge turned down, her heart pounding as if it were trying to overrun the reality she could no longer escape. For decades she had survived Ridge's wrathfulness because it was always followed by craving, by remorse, by love pulling him back. This time there was none of that. What she saw in his eyes wasn't fury alone, it was futurity. Ridge left the house with a purpose that startled indeed himself. He didn't slam doors or throw objects. Rather, his movements were controlled, deliberate, and unmistakably endless. Each step down from Brooke felt like slipping a weight he'd carried for far too long, indeed as grief pressed hard against his casket. He told himself that walking down was an act of tone respect, not atrocity. He'd spent times excusing Brooke's choices, reconsidering treason as misreading, persuading himself that her intentions signified further than the damage left before. Steffy's disclosure stripped down those apologies, leaving only the verity Brooke had chosen control over honesty, and that choice had shaped their lives in ways he could no longer accept. At Forrester Creations the pressure was palpable. Workers rumored in hallways, their voices dropping whenever Ridge passed by. He carried himself else now, straighter, colder, and unmistakably closed off. The man who formerly blurred the lines between particular chaos and professional leadership now executed boundaries with ruthless clarity. Designs were approved or rejected without vacillation. Meetings were shorter, sharper, and stripped of warmth. Ridge threw himself into work not as an escape, but as a protestation that this chapter of his life was over. Steffy watched her father nearly, torn between relief and guilt. She had told herself that revealing the verity was the right thing to do, that Ridge merited to know what Brooke had hidden. Yet witnessing the fate forced her to defy the cost of honesty. Her father looked aged ever, as if the vision he'd lived under had been the only thing keeping him whole. Still, Steffy refused to apologize for exposing the verity. She had grown up watching Brooke's secrets fracture her family again and again, always leaving Ridge to pick up the pieces. This time Steffy believed the cycle had to end. Brooke, meanwhile, retreated into insulation. Musketeers reached out, but she veered their concern with rehearsed countenance. Intimately she maintained quality, Intimately, she unraveled. The house that formerly represented consanity now felt like a gallery of failure. Every snap of her and Ridge mocked her with recollections of pledges she believed would endure anything. She replayed the once relentlessly, asking herself when silence had come deception, when protection had crossed into treason. For the first time, Brooke was forced to admit that her fear of losing Ridge had eventually guaranteed that loss. Hope plotted further than anyone anticipated. As Brooke's son, she had spent her life defending her mama against allegations of manipulation and egoism. She had believed fiercely that Brooke's heart was always in the right place. Now, brazened with the reality of what her mama had concealed, Hope set up herself questioning not just Brooke's choices, but her own hypotheticals. She loved her mama deeply, yet she couldn't ignore the pain etched into Ridge's face or the quiet desolation that followed his departure. The fracture forced Hope to grow up in ways she was unrehearsed for, balancing fidelity with responsibility. Eric Forrester's disappointment cut deeper than wrathfulness ever could. As the primogenitor of the family, he'd seen generations repeat the same miscalculations, each believing their love story would be the exception. He mourned not only the breakdown of Ridge and Brooke's relationship, but the corrosion of trust that hovered the Forrester heritage itself. Eric understood better than anyone that secrets were the true villains of their family history. They had destroyed marriages, alienated children, and depraved intentions into munitions. Watching history reprise itself was a burden he carried heavily. Taylor's shadow impended large over the fallout, indeed in her absence. The implied question hung in the air: was this eventually the end of Ridge and Brooke's endless cycle? For times, Taylor had lived on the fringe of Ridge's life, always connected, no way completely free. The possibility of her return burned enterprise, stopgap, and fear in equal measure. Some believed Ridge would seek comfort in familiarity. Others bothered that continuing old injuries would only consolidate his pain. Ridge himself avoided the study, determined not to replace one emotional reliance with another. As days turned into weeks, the consequences of Ridge's decision gurgled outward. Brooke tried conciliation, not with dramatic gestures, but with quiet vulnerability. She conceded her miscalculations without defenses, admitting that fear had guided her choices further than love. Yet every attempt was met with the same impenetrable wall. Ridge heeded, but he didn't soften. Remission, he realized, was an commodity he owed simply because of history. It had to be earned, and indeed also it might not come. The public nature of their separation added another subcast of complexity. In Los Angeles, secrets infrequently stay hidden for long. Rumors circulated, each more inflated than the last. Brooke faced judgment not just from those who knew the verity, but from non-natives eager to assign blame. Ridge, though shielded by sympathy, felt exposed and vulnerable in ways he hadn't anticipated. Ending effects with Brooke meant dismembering a public identity he'd lived under for decades. He was no longer part of a fabulous love story. He was a man standing alone, reconsidering himself in the fate of loss. Steffy's resoluteness hardened as she faced counter-reaction for her part in the disclosure. Some indicted her of atrocity, others of manipulation. She accepted the review without reason. To Steffy, the verity signified further than perception. She had watched her father compromise his happiness for too long, and she refused to remain silent any longer. Still, the weight of responsibility dallied. She wondered if honesty always justified the destruction it caused, indeed when it was necessary. Ridge's nights were the hardest. Without Brooke, the quiet came rough. Memories surfaced unasked, reminding him of moments of joy that were now thick from treason. Yet indeed in his grief, Ridge felt commodity's strange peace. The chaos that formerly defined his emotional life had given way to clarity. He was no longer staying for the coming argument, the coming disclosure, the coming reason. For the first time, Ridge allowed himself to imagine a future not defined by survival but by choice. Brooke's trip toward responsibility was slow and painful. She brazened the verity she had avoided for times, that loving someone doesn't grant the right to decide their reality. In trying to cover Ridge, she had denied him agency, shaping his life grounded on her fears rather than his requirements. Accepting that verity stripped Brooke of the victim narrative she had cleaved to, forcing her to face the consequences of her conduct without deviation. As the family navigated this new reality, connections were tested and converted. Some bonds strengthened through honesty, while others fractured under the weight of resentment. The Forrester family stood at a crossroads, their future uncertain, their once insolvable to undo. Ridge's explosive rejection of Brooke wasn't just a dramatic moment, it was a reckoning that demanded growth, responsibility, and change from everyone involved. And as the dust sluggishly settled, one thing came clear: this wasn't simply the end of a relationship, but the dismantling of a myth. The belief that Ridge and Brooke were ineluctable, unbreakable, and fated to endure anything had eventually been shattered. What would rise in its place, redemption, renewal, or remorse, remained to be seen. But one verity echoed louder than all others: nothing would ever be the same again. Time didn't soften the rupture between Ridge Forrester and Brooke Logan, however. Distance stoned it, sculpturing clarity where confusion formerly lived. If anything, Ridge set up himself, defying a verity he'd avoided for utmost of his adult life. Love, when paired with constant treason, purposeful or not, becomes a form of tone erasure. Every concession he'd made for Brooke replayed in his mind like a tally of emotional debts no way repaid. What hurt most wasn't the secret itself, but the consummation that Brooke had believed she knew better than he did about his own life. That arrogance, disguised as protection, was the crack that refused to close. Brooke's world continued to shrink. Assignations braked. Phone calls came shorter. The social circles she formerly navigated with ease now carried an turnabout of judgment, whether spoken or not. She had been numerous effects in her life, Ms. New, controversial, recalcitrant, but no way inapplicable. Now, stripped of Ridge's presence and the power it represented, Brooke was forced to face herself without distraction. She began to understand that important of her identity had been shaped by surviving chaos rather than erecting stability. Ridge had been both her anchor and her reason. At Forrester Creations, the emotional earthquake began to affect business. Buyers noticed Ridge's colder address. Designs took on sharper lines, darker palettes, reflecting an internal shift he made no attempt to conceal. Fashion for Ridge had always been an extension of emotion, and now that emotion was restraint mixed with defiance. Eric observed the change with conservative blessing. Though he mourned the fracture of the family, he couldn't deny that Ridge appeared more focused, more predicated, and less reactive than he'd been in times. Steffy stepped further into leadership, her confidence solidifying as she watched her father reclaim control of his life. Yet intimately, she scuffled with complicated feelings. She had wanted the verity to set Ridge free, but freedom, she realized, came with loneliness. Watching Ridge eat alone in his office late at night, gaping out at the megacity lights with a look of quiet abidance, unsettled her. This wasn't the triumphant emancipation she had imagined. It was commodity heavier, more endless. Hope, meanwhile, set up herself navigating a moral Argentine zone she had always defied. Supporting her mama felt spontaneous, but excusing her conduct no longer did. For the first time, Hope began to see the ripple goods of silence, how one withheld verity could reshape generations. She questioned her own choices, her own apologies, wondering how frequently she had incorrect good intentions for ethical clarity. The fracture between Ridge and Brooke forced Hope to develop in ways love alone no way could. Brooke's attempts at reconditioning were regular rather than hopeless. She sought remedy not for optics but for survival. The sessions stripped her defenses bare, exposing patterns she had no way wanted to admit. Control had always been her guard. When life felt changeable, Brooke withheld information, believing that managing issues equated to love. Facing the damage that belief caused was humiliating but also transformative. For the first time, she stopped asking when Ridge would forgive her, and began asking who she was without his remission. Ridge avoided answer comfort, surprising indeed himself. Musketeers assumed he'd turn to familiarity, to someone who knew his history and could soothe his pain. Rather, Ridge chose solitariness. It wasn't discipline, it was recalibration. He demanded to know who he was when he wasn't replying to Brooke's choices. Nights were long, filled with recollections that surfaced unasked, but he met them head-on rather than drowning them in distraction. Grief, he learned, loses power when it's conceded rather than avoided. The family gatherings came simulated. Leaves arrived with forced grins and precisely curated guest lists. Brooke and Ridge enthralled the same spaces on occasion, but no way together. Their relations were civil, subdued, and devoid of warmth. The absence of volatility, The very thing that formerly defined their relationship made the separation feel indeed more final. Everyone noticed. The lack of chaos was its own form of